Hi, in today's class we are going to talk about first language acquisition by children. We are going to discuss how children are able to acquire language rather than inherit them. In Jenny's case, as we have seen in the previous chapter, a girl who was kept away from any language interaction. This case, in fact, was unfortunate but well-documented case. We have gained some insight into what happens when the critical period passes without adequate linguistic input. This case happens in the 70s. A girl who was in her 30s spent most of her life tied to a chair in a small closed room. Her father was intolerant of any kind of noise and had beaten her whenever she made a sound as a child. There had been no radio or television. Jenny's only other human contact was her mother, who was forbidden to spend more than a few minutes with the child to feed her. So Jenny was unable to use language when she was first brought into care. However, within a short period of time, she began to respond to the speech of others. She tried to imitate sounds. She used syntax, but her syntax was very simple. Generally speaking, the process of language acquisition has some basic requirements. The child has to interact with other language users in order to bring the general language capacity he or she has into operation. In Jenny's case, we have already seen that a child who doesn't hear or is not allowed to use language will learn no language. Cultural transmission. The language a child learns is not genetically inherited, but is acquired in a particular language using environment. Generally speaking, there are basic requirements for infants or children to learn language. First of all, they have to be physically capable. They have to be able to speak and hear. In fact, all infants make cooing and babbling noises during their first year, but deaf infants stop after about 6 months. So, is hearing enough? When you expose a child to a TV and he hears or she hears, is that enough for her to learn language? In order to speak a language, a child must be able to hear that language being used. But itself, however, hearing language sound is not enough. One reported case has demonstrated that with deaf parents who gave their normal hearing son ample exposure to TV and radio programs, the boy didn't acquire an ability to speak or understand English. What he did learn very effectively by the age of 3 was the language he used to interact with his parents. So it is not possible for a child to speak a language by only hearing that language, unless there is what is called interaction with others via language. So the child has to interact with her or with his caregiver speech or the people around him in order to speak a language or to develop the ability to speak and interact in real life situation about a language. There is what is called the theory of input. An input is the language that an acquirer learner is exposed to in contrast to output. How do we talk to babies and children? There is what is called caregiver speech. Speech addressed to young children by adults or older children who are looking after them. It's also called motherese child-directed speech. In order for a child to speak a language, he has to have what is called input. The input is done by either mother or the child-directed speech. So what are the characteristics of good caregiver speech? It has frequent use of questions, exaggerated intonations, extra loudness, slow rhythm with long pauses, and simple sentence structure with a lot of repetition. So baby talks forms simplified words, for example, tummy, nana, or alternative forms with repeated simple sounds and syllables for things in the child's environment. For example, nana, nanu, poo poo, dads, and so on. This is how caregiver usually interacts with a baby in order to acquire a language. All normal children develop language at roughly the same time, along the same schedule. The same applies to biological development and physical activities. The biological schedule is very much related to the maturation of the infant's brain to cope with the linguistic input. So the first stage of acquiring language is called cooing. With the cooing, it begins in the first months of the child's age. The child begins producing high vowels like E and O. In the 4 months old, the child starts producing velar consonants like K and Ga. This is called cooing and gooing. In 5 months age, there is a difference between the vowels R and E is made by the child, just like with syllables with Ba and Ga. Well, so the babbling age starts from the age 8 to 6 months, where a child produces a number of different vowels, consonants, and combinations like baba, gaga. So this is called babbling. At the age of 9 to 10 months, recognizable intonation patterns to the consonant and vowel combinations being produced. There is also a variation in the combinations like ba, ba, da, da, with nasal sounds become common and certain syllable sequences also appear, ma, ma, and da, da. This is called the babbling age. Well, so the one-word stage begins at the age 12 to 18 months. In this stage, there is a recognizable single unit utterances. The child uses terms for everyday objects like milk, cookie, cap, cup, and spoon. The term used to refer to this stage is called holophrastic utterance, where a single form functioning as a phrase or sentence in the early speech of young children. The child produces utterance such as Sarah bed, but not yet capable of producing more complex phrases. At the two-word stage, which begins at the 18 to 20 months, the vocabulary moves beyond 50 words. By the age of 2 years old, the children produce utterances like baby chair, mummy, eat. Interpretation depends on context. Probably the child just mean baby chair, this is baby's chair, put baby in chair, baby is in the chair. Adults behave, those who interact with the child should behave just as if communication is taking place. The child is not really produces speech but receives feedback confirming that the utterance worked as a contribution to the interaction. By this age, whether the child is producing 200 or 300 words, he or she will be capable of understanding five times as many. Another stage that begins at the age of 2 to 2 years and a half is called telegraphic speech, where the child starts to produce multiple word speech. The characteristics of this stage, in fact, there is a strings of words, lexical morphemes without inflectional morphemes. So the child probably would say, "Daddy, go bye-bye," produced by 2-year-old children. Well, so for most children, no one provides any instruction on how the child should speak the language. Children actively construct from what is said to them the possible ways of using the language. They try out constructions and testing whether they work or not. It is also unlikely that adults' corrections are a very effective determiner of how the children speak. You could Go over the example and see that even correcting a child is not an effective way to teach the child how to speak. One important factor in the development of the child's linguistic repertoire is the actual use of sound and word combinations. So in interactions with others, in wordplay, you could go to page 176 in the book and you see the example, I go this way bay do this bib, all bib there. This is an example of how the child develops a language by using sound and word combinations. Now we move to the developing morphology stage. This happens almost in 2.5 years old. The use of some inflectional morphemes to indicate the grammatical function of nouns and verbs. The first inflectional to appear is the ing, for example, cat sitting, mommy reading book, and so on. With developing morphology stage, the next morphological development is typically the marking of regular plurals, like boys and cats. But this is, in fact, accompanied by what is called overgeneralization process, whereby a child overgeneralizes the rule of adding s plurals to all the nouns, even if they are irregular plurals. For example, the word food and men's. More characteristics of developing morphology appears. For example, the possessive s appears in mommy's back. The different forms of verb to be appear, as well as irregular verbs, past. The ed inflection may be added to everything here, so it's just like overgeneralization process of the s plural. The child works out after the age of 4 which forms are regular and which are not, just like the third person singular and so on. Similar evidence against imitation as the basis of the child's speech production has been found in studies with the syntactic structures used by young children. So a child was asked to say, the owl who eats candy runs fast, and she said, the owl eat candy and he ran fast. In the developing of syntax, we will look at two structures that seem to be acquired in a regular way by most English-speaking children. In the formation of questions and the use of negatives, there appear to be 3 identifiable stages. The ages at which children go through these stages can vary quite a bit, but the general pattern seems to be the same. So stage 1 occurs between 18 and 26 months, stage 2 occurs between 22 and 30 months, stage 3 occurs between 24 and 40 months. With forming questions, as stated above, there are 3 main stages. The first stage is characterized by simply adding WH form where who to the beginning of the expression, for example, where kitty, where doggy, where horse go. It's also characterized by the utter of expression with a rise in intonation towards the end. So sit, chair. Well, so the second stage is characterized by more complex expressions can be formed. Rising intonation strategy continues to be used. For example, you want eat, see my doggy. With more WH forms come into use. For example, what book name? Why you smiling? And so on. With the third stage, the acquired inversion of subject and verb in English questions appears. For example, I can go. Can I go? Can I have a piece? Will you help me? But the WH questions do not always undergo the required inversion. How that happened? Why Kitty can't stand up? The third stage questions are generally quite close to the adult model. What did you do? It is just like an example of a memorized as a chunk. The forming of negatives by children has also 3 stages. The first stage involves a simple strategy of putting no or not at the beginning. For example, not a teddy bear, no sit here, no fall. With the second stage of forming negative, the additional